Hi, and welcome to the show. I'm so glad you could join us this evening. I'm Brian from Bankstown, and today I'm going to be showing you how I made this. It's an advert, like the kind you might find at the supermarket or in the newspaper, because it's the 80s and we don't have Facebook yet. But if we take a look closer at this ad, we can see that there are some things that aren't quite right. So if you would like to skip ahead, please look at the time codes on the bottom of the screen now. Today's subject isn't very difficult. All you're going to need is a camera, your phone, and some basic photo editing software, like Photoshop or even Snapchat. So the first thing on our list is costumes. I picked my costume out way in advance, and as you can see, it's not very complex. It's just a knitted jersey because I took the photo in winter and old people love knitted jerseys. But as I like to say, the most important thing isn't the clothes you're wearing, but it's how you're wearing them. As you can see in my image, I chose to wear a number of sweatshirts. This adds a layer of mystery and just a little bit of intrigue to the photo. Another thing to remember to do is your hair. You can see in my picture that I used a comb over, which is dead convenient because I'm naturally balding anyway, and a comb over is the hairstyle I typically choose to go with. But what you're wearing doesn't matter if you take your photo in the wrong place. Set selection is a really important part of your photograph. For a project like this, you want to pick a location that's nonsensical without being too bizarre. And I bring that up because as funny as this photo is, Brian hovering over the toilet is nowhere near as funny as Brian just standing in the shower. Set selection, pose, and costumes. These things will tie together to create the perfect photo, but only if you try. Brian's bit number one. There's a really fine line between what's bizarrely real and what's obviously fake, and you have to toe that line really carefully. But keep all that in mind, because choosing these things, choosing your costumes, choosing your sets, and choosing your poses will all come together. They'll really sell that photo, but you really, really, really need to put the effort in. Now, because this is a really simple advert, I chose to keep things, well, simple. Just a phone camera, no lights, and a tripod. Everything about this photo is meant to screen. I have no idea what I'm doing. So if you feel that way while making your photo, just know that you're on the right track. And you might be asking, Brian, what if I don't have a tripod? Well, maybe you should take boomer posting more seriously. If you don't have a tripod by this point in the game, what are you doing? You can't just come into boomer posting and not take it seriously. You can't just take a photo off Google Images and pass it off as your own. You just can't. You can't build up a story based on a stock photo. Put some effort in. Buy a tripod. Do the most basic stuff to just... there are whole AI art generators out there that you could be using to create a photo. But you're just on here, on the internet, using Google, www.stockphotooldlady.com, and trying to pass it off as your own. Why? Or you could just use an old shell. It's entirely up to you. But once we've taken our photo, we can move into FaceApp. And let's be honest, if you're here, you don't need my help using FaceApp, but there's always one thing that I like to remind people. Just keep your eye out for weird artifacting. Oftentimes around the eyes, or the mouth, the neck, and the collar, you see some weird blending issues that happen, and you might just want to go in there with an eraser and tidy all that up. But if you're looking for a little more pizzazz, there's a few different things you can do. One of my favorite techniques is to take my photo with a frown, and then in FaceApp, I add on a smile, and then I erase the lines around the eyes. This gives quite an unsettling look, and adds just a touch of horror to your creation. But with all that out of the way, we can bring everything from our FaceApp and into Photoshop, where we can begin assembling our advert. But there is a lot going on, from the font choice to the furniture. So let's take this from the top, work our way down, and go from there. Right there, top of the page, nice big title. It's the first thing our eyes are drawn to. Now, if you're coming up with a title, try and remember this. 2 words. 2 words. That's 2 words, which ironically is also 2 words. But what I'm trying to say to you is keep your title 2 words. Room available. Free dog. No smoking. By keeping things 2 words, you simplify your idea and make it easy for the general reader to grasp. Moving down the page, you can see that we have a paragraph that kind of describes things in a little bit more depth. Now, this here explains a little bit more about my character and my character's backstory. Now, backstory is something we call a narrative tool. And like many narrative tools, there have been centuries spent trying to figure out how to explain it. I'm going to do it for them. What we've done here is we've made a backstory for our character that will further inform the mid-story and will finally resolve by the end of the story to create one cohesive narrative that will take you from the start to the end over one single sheet of paper. Do you understand? And for me, putting this into practice meant seeding a little joke right at the beginning and then paying it off near the end to create a whole joke that, when told completely from start to finish, has the intended effect of making people laugh. So putting this into practice, it means seeding a joke at the beginning. Brian's wife Glenda has gone to stay with her sister. Further moving down the page, this joke comes back with more sinister overtones, because boomer hate wife, ha ha ha, that's the joke. After seeding the joke in the first paragraph, we move down to Brian describing his dream tenant. And while it might not initially seem that way, the joke here is quite multi-layered. Let me break it down for you. First, we start with Brian demanding a male tenant, carefully noting that females will not be considered. This plays off the trope of an older gentleman wanting a female roommate so that he can objectify her. Next, Brian goes on to describe his dream male tenant, who has a lot of very typically feminine attributes. This is a subversion of expectations on what Brian, who is a typical man's man, might expect from his man flatmate. What we see here is an assessment of a psyche of a person who is deeply emotionally repressed, and who, when we look at it, maybe is their own worst enemy to themselves. Lastly, Brian asks for someone who is good with plumbing and wears a lot of white t-shirts, and this, I think, represents the fact that Brian is extremely cheap and doesn't want to pay for a plumber, which is why he's standing in the shower. And if you see, it's like it's all connected. There's just layers upon layers of subtext, and I mean, whatever. Now you, of course, can come up with your own list, but I don't think it will be as funny as the one that I've got. But once we've got our list, we can move on to the part of the poster that I think everyone loves, and that is the house rules. Now, the reason why this is so much fun is because not only is it my house, my rules, but this isn't even a real advert, right? We're just having fun. So these rules can be as bonkers as you want them to be, and I recommend just going bonkers. And for most people, this is the part of the poster where we can advance our story, and we can use this space to tell jokes and advance our story, which, as we talked about before, is something that we can do to make A, B, and C link up. But this brings me to Brian's bit number 2, and that is always be boomer. But what does boomer mean? Well, boomer is be only original, make everyone respect. And I think that's a really good synonym for how to move forward with everything. I actually think it's such good advice. I'm now wondering why I put it at page 6 of the script and not actually far earlier on, because now that I think about it, would have been really good at the first page. But using this abbreviation in the creation of your poster, and especially your house rules, I think will help you craft something that is truly, truly funny. So just remember, you can only succeed if you boomer. And look, by now you're probably thinking, Brian, what makes you so funny? How come all of your jokes are just hilarious and everybody loves them? Well, I'm going to tell you. We'll start from the top, and by the end of it, you'll understand what makes my jokes so much funnier than your jokes. Now look, let's start from the first sentence. You will be given free reign of the house, but there are some rules to follow. That is hilarious. Free reign and rules are two words that just shouldn't be in the same sentence, let alone the same... What? That doesn't make any sense. Now, just as backstory is a narrative technique, juxtaposition is a comedic technique, and that's when you take two things that aren't typically associated with each other and you juxtapose them. So like cats and dogs. These are two opposites. They're two things that shouldn't be put in this, and that's why free reign and rules, that's what makes that joke funny. The next rule is great. Let's read that together. You must drive me around, I lost my license, after some clown changed the position of reverse and drive on my gear stick and made me crash into a bus stop. Now, this joke is funny because it plays on the stereotype of elderly people exploiting their flatmates for free labor. And that is funny because it's a bait and switch, because you thought I was going to make a joke about elderly people not being very good drivers. And that's because they're not. But by this point, we've managed to lure our audience in with jokes that are borderline outlandish, but still somewhat believable. So let's change that. So for the second house rule, I decided to give Brian a weird foot thing. I can't say the word because it's 1986 and the censors will get weird about that. But rather than being some kind of dirty thing, I like the idea that Brian's rule is that he wants all footwear kept in his bedroom. I like to think that Brian would demand that even visitors to his home also keep their shoes and socks in his bedroom. The weirdest rule is the third rule, which is no personal devices are to be taken into the bedrooms. Which, when coupled with the idea that the computer is in the living room, and if you want to use the internet you have to go to the living room, it's just, like I'm sure I don't need to explain to you why this is funny. Like, just laugh. And I think what really ties this whole thing together is the last joke, which is don't go into the freezer. And this is a callback to the joke at the beginning. And a callback is another narrative technique that I'm using to tell this story. And when we take this beginning and middle and end and we put them all, what we can start to see is this circular pattern of like rhyme. It's like a rhyme. It starts here and it ends here. And it's quite cinematic in a way. It encompasses these ideas of storytelling and comedy in a way that feels quite grand and film-like almost, if you truly wanted to believe that. And at this point, now that we're here and I've been recording for almost 40 minutes, you might think, Brian, can we call it a day yet? No, don't be lazy. There's one last thing that we could do that brings this all together. And I'm not talking about Minions memes, but I am talking about something very closely related to that. 2 words, you see, it's like poetry, it rhymes. 2 words, clip art. Clip art. Clip art is good. It's all the things that you want for your boomer post. So, you can see what I've did. I apologize, that was not good English. And so you can see what I've done with the clip art. First I've put it in the back as kind of like a watermark, and I've also used it at the bottom, which is something you could also do. And if you followed my instructions exactly, you'll have a picture that's worth exactly 399 likes, but not a single one more, because that would be too much. And why? Why couldn't it just be 400? Why did you have to stop at 399? Seriously, is it not worth 400? But if you've followed along, then thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. If you would like to see more episodes of Boomerposting with Brian, then please let me know, because I would love to make more. But from me to you. Have a good night. Be wearing those amount of things. Bye 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 bye. So if you feel that way while making your photo, just know that you're on the right track. Is that weird enough? Is this I hope this is funny. One of my favorite techniques is to take my photo with a smile. Nope, that wasn't correct. If we look at my image, we can see that there's a lot going on because I'm actually really smart and there's a ton that I've put in here that you would never pick up on because you just... I feel like that's too arrogant. I need to stop going off script so much. That was fake. One more. Because that is genuinely the objective of jokes. Oh great, there's a moth. I feel like the arrogance isn't working. I don't know if I can... I'm just not an arrogant person. So it's time to change that. So let's change that. So let's change that. So... I feel like I'm not going to get this believably cringe enough because it's so embarrassing. And if you've followed my